There you go. That frightened me. Oh, my goodness. So they followed basically patriarchal lines. Major places. For example, they would be the rite of Antioch, Alexandria, Rome. Then we'd see I'm going to make sure I don't say all of them because I want to make sure everybody gets those. Okay, they had from the major cities, which would have been Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, Antioch, Jerusalem. So you had all these things, and then within that little group, you would have a disbursement of usages. So an example of a difference between like a rite and a usage would be like, for example, in the other rite, which was an oddity, not being of a patriarch area or a major city, was just called in general Gallican or Gaelic, not Gaelic as in Irish Gaelic or whatever, but as in France, Gaul, ancient France. And what happened was when it went up there, that's where we would begin to see all the, I don't want to, in great respect and holiness, because I think it's beautiful and lovely, all the bells and whistles. We see, the development of the tradition and the use more often of the Gloria, because the Gloria wasn't always used every single time they met, because you're still doing it daily, but it would be for a bishop would be there on Sundays and things like that. But within the big monolith, we would see those things. Now, again, I'm going to sort of veer into the Gallic, and it sounds like garlic. Gallic? The Gallic. It sounds very Louisiana. Okay. The Gallic region, because this is where we see transformation to what we see at Trent eventually. So I'm going to keep going and, yeah. I'm just going to keep going. But what happened at this point is when we get all this transition and we have all these different things, we would see in areas they developing their own rite within the Gallican rite, meaning like in Milan, we hear the Ambrosian rite, which they were not going to change even at gunpoint, and they still have it. Also, what we refer to as the Mozarabic rite. It was in Spain, Toledo, where there was great influence in North Africa. It was actually in Latin, but the Latin was, if you were just listening to the tone, would sound like it was from somewhere east of Jerusalem, because it would be like, instead of just Sanctus, Sanctus, it'd be like Sanctus, I mean, it's just very, has that North African, Arabic, I don't know how to do it, but just do the wiggle thing, with the hand. But because its tones are totally different than what, our ears are used to. But those things developed into themselves. Now, a lot of people believe that they can trace back the origins of the Gallic from the Antiochian church. So it kind of, went by ocean.
What church?
Antioch.
Oh, the Antioch, okay.
And they kind of went from that, and that's where they kind of had they were a bit more, there was a lot more to it than the Roman liturgy. So they developed from that. Now, from this time, everything was kind of being established in those things. Everything, again, like I said, uniformity, but not absolute conformity, and everything's the same thing. The trappings are all different, but the Eucharistic prayer, same. So we developed into, okay, guys, we're trying to get it all together. We want to make sure that we're not overdoing it anyway, and we have the new empire, so we need to try to be more uniform so we're not confusing everybody to death, including ourselves. So what they do is we start to see missals. Now, these things aren't new. What they did was they collected all the prayers from various regions. Most of the time the popes would call on these, like, go bring them from the various areas and we're going to put it together. Nothing was actually ever cut out. It was just kind of, it was put together. And they, most of it was addition. So what happened was the French, the Gallic stuff, influenced the Roman. So we went from very austere and have nothing in between to, okay, now we have all this greater piety, which we see kind of the Eastern influence into it. That's why you see some places in Europe, especially if you go into Ireland, Scotland, and England, those in the area that survived, you would see even in the Anglican liturgy, the use of icons, paintings versus statues. So that's just kind of a little bit of influence. But first we had the Leonin Missal or Sacramentary Heaven included, which attributes to Pope Leo. Then we have the Galatian, Pope Leo. And then we have the Gregorian. Everybody recognize one. Gregory. We know Gregorian. We took him. we know him. So we have these things, and I'm very much, keep, because it's very complicated, and it would take us forever, literally. But we see the development. First came Leonin, then came Gelasian, then came Gregorian. There wasn't much change in them except inserting prayers and on occasion reducing the variety of, say, of the opening prayers and prefaces for the Mass. The things where we start off prayer, offer, we offer the prayer, and then we say, the Lord be with you with your spirit, and we kind of go, oh Lord God of all creation, going through that before we lead to the consecration. And kind of put those down because they were like, there are way too many of these things. But they didn't necessarily get rid of them. They kind of like, these are the ones we're going to do. So we see this codification, this development, and then finally we see.
What years?
I'm sorry. The Leonin, let's see, would be about between 440 and 461, and a little bit after that. And then we had the Galatian, which was 492 into the 500s, and then Gregory, the Gregorian, which would fold into 590 into the 600s.
When was the Gloria incorporated?
That was actually the Gallicans helped us with that one.
Oh, truly?
And so that's whenever we were studying the liturgy in seminary, we're like, we think of dolls. Because, it's funny because the Roman liturgy was, as I said, there wasn't a lot to it. Because look where it developed. We're being persecuted. It's going to be short, to the point, and have that. So that's kind of where we took that, and whenever we say the Roman liturgy is very simple, that's what we mean by it. We're meaning that in comparison to the Eastern Rite, we are very simple prayer people. And this was talking about the Gregorian Masses and things like that. So, if you've ever seen those, and the chants and all the things that were included, the Confiteor added at the at the preparation, prayers at the foot of the altar. This is when they were kind of beginning to be brought in. And also the second Confiteor, right before Eucharist, right before reception, Holy Communion. So these things are all going to be added. So we can thank the Gallicans for all those nifty, wonderful things that we got. And they were also really big on including prayers for the dead. I thank them because they're going to help me later on in a different stage of life. So we jump to, we're focusing specifically on the Gregorian, or as we all know, attributed to St. Gregory the Great, and the chant, which we have musical notation a little bit earlier than this, the actual writing out, because most people just has it memorized. But he was able to initiate, he wouldn't be able to complete, but they gave his name to it, the chants, to which we still hold to today as a tradition, and all the way back in 600s and earlier. So a lot of these things were already kind of going on, but they just were codified at that point. Like most things in the church, we don't get around to writing it down and making it standardized until things start to go a little bit crazy. Okay guys, we're getting a little bit too much. So they kind of pulled that in, and the Roman liturgy became Gallican influence, so we see the two coming together, but the Roman was very much influenced by the Gallicans, the Franks. So, and that's where it kind of led to, and I'm going to jump because that's where we kind of jump through, is the Gregorian Mass was almost identical to the Mass of St. Pius V. when we had the Council of Trent. The only thing that he added was, and I take this word transitioning, he saw from the Gallican Masses, it was included in the book. The prayers for the altar were included officially as a part of the Mass, part of the ritual, which were usually said beforehand as a pious devotion. So you get all these devotions and different beautiful prayers. They just started putting them in, and they codified them into what we had, what Pius V put together, and we put a stamp on, even though it was completed until after his death. But very little had changed. It was just, maybe one or two things were omitted, but there was more put in than omit. So when we think about Tridentine Latin or extraordinary form, again, however you want to call it, was basically looking like, you wouldn't be confused if you were to say go to 500 AD, looking at those developing into the Gregorian Mass.
When you said he put those things in, you're talking about Pius or Gregor?
Pius.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I wasn't sure about the antecedent there.
Because there was kind of still going, yes.
What about the things like reading the Gospels as part of the Mass? And the homily, when did that come in?
That actually came into when Pius V began, because he wanted to make sure that everything was, we have it together. Because one of the things back early on was the readings were taken, they weren't necessary, they were in a general cycle, like in the Jewish calendar, but the person reading would continue reading until the bishop gave the signal to stop. So, and we have notes in the books when they were beginning, when they're making them, when they're writing them out. This is this section. He usually says stop here. And I'm just like, thank you for changing, because they could go on, it's like the beginning of Genesis. Now the book of Deuteronomy is like, oh my God. That's a great Roman mentality, But those things were being codified more. And that's when the last gospel was actually brought into it. The last gospel being the first section of John. So after Mass, well, still in Mass, but you would say the last gospel, which was usually on a card right there. You'd say the last gospel, everybody can follow along with it. But that's when things, this was already kind of being commonly practiced, and then Pius codified it, put it in the book. Okay, this is the stuff we're going to use, and then I'll jump. Yes?
I was just wondering, the homily, was it always at the discretion of the priest or celebrant of what they say that, or did it used to be prescribed how they would explain the Gospels to the people?
This is the time period, actually, when the homilies, and we say sermon in a proper sense, because if you're a Chrysostom, you're Ambrose, or Augustine, or the like, your sermon could go on a very long time, which was okay, because the people wanted you, and they would look at you like, he's only gone for an hour and 20 minutes, not taking nearly enough. I don't like this guy.
Well, that sounds like a Baptist too.
I mean, they would keep continuing going on, but they would kind of follow along with that. They would have prayers, readings, and then they would go on and usually explain the readings. And this is when our theology was developing. And what happened was during, I'm jumping way back, is when we see all these, the heresies start coming up, like, well, Christ was just divine, or Christ was just human, but he didn't, they took the human soul out of this person and stuffed the divine soul in there. And so they had all these things, and they were just like, guys, this ain't great, we need to fix this. And so
the
actually the
celebrant was actually creating those?
No, he was, the theology was there, but it had to develop.
Mm-hmm.
And actually through homilies, people were like, something is not right with that priest. And so bishops would find out about it, and they're just like, it don't work that way. Guys, we need to make the creed better. So that, like through Nicaea and things like that, and it would develop. And actually, most of the time, all the preaching was done on readings and then through the various mysteries of the faith. Eucharist, baptism, Chrysostom, and Cyril of Jerusalem loved to talk about the sacraments. So they would focus mainly on those because they connected to everything. So that's kind of how it developed through that. But once we get to Pius, that's when he's like, okay, this is the structure, this is what we use, but even with that, they still will usages, excuse me. For example, in Britain, you would have the psalm rite, or the psalm usage, which would be, look almost exactly like this, except with a few extra things. One would be that when the priest is praying at a certain point, he preaches a prayer, he makes the sign of the cross with his body, almost like the Carmelites do. So that would be part of it, and there would be other things as well, and they had a specific type of chant. The same with certain places in Gaul and so on and so forth, but they kept that. But at a certain point, they were coming to more conformity, but then the Protestant Reformation kind of took care of. The diversity kind of fizzled out because there was a revolt, and the Mass was literally under attack, because they would use the same structure for the most part, as in when things happened, when we had readings, when this and that and the other, but they would strategically pull out words like sacrifice and this, that, and the other, and no more priests, no more this, and this. And of course, as we know, snipping through the Bible, taking this out, doing this and that and the other. And when all that was happening is when Trent happened. We got the Catechism of Trent, which we base our current catechism on. And it became that codification of it. So that, okay, you're a Catholic, and this is what Catholic means. We have this because we've been using it since the beginning of time, that we can remember. So we have this codified. Now, in between the time periods, there were, I say, in very, very small, form, as in the teensy-weensy, meaning that certain things were, maybe reduced for the sake of brevity, or some things were a little bit removed, or because some of the Holy Week things would go on for the entirety of the Holy Day, and they were just like, this is wonderful and holy, but we're not Eastern. It's kind of like that mentality. But these things would be shortened, no, this is when the second confiteor was added, I believe. But then, after a while, the second confiteor was taken out, meaning that you'd pray at the beginning of Mass, I confess to Almighty God, and then you would say it again right before you received communion. When we got up into, I'm jumping a couple of centuries here, because there wasn't a lot that happened in between, as in tweaks. We see with, I'm jumping way ahead. See, there's no highlights, that's the after 1570, there were just a few revisions, meaning that, again, the confiteor changed. When we got to Pius X, actually, I take that back. Because of things like, it was mostly done because of carelessness, because we had the printing press, and some things kind of got messed up. So we know some things get messed up in the middle of somebody misputting something somewhere in the printing press or what have you. It's just like, you gotta fix that. So you actually see little documents come out saying, change that word, don't use that word, or change this around this way. You see little those. Pope Clement the Eighth did this with a few things where things were not quite the correct wording, nothing as in like Eucharistic prayers, but little bitty things like that. But Pius X made the first major revision. I'm saying air quotes because what he did is he modified plain chant and gave us plain, because he's like, this is what we use in lieu of an organ. This is always what kind of used. So you want to use this and make it simpler, and so that chant was made for everybody to be able to sing, because you can be tone deaf and be able to chant, believe it or not. And sometimes that force you. If you've been at those masses, you're
Why do we have two creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed?
one was just shortened versions for, the first one, the Apostles' Creed, would kind of been the precursor to the Nicene. So what it was is basically the Nicene became the extended form, more of okay, we're having all these heresies, so we need to just kind of clarify what we're saying. Like with the word, is consubstantial the same of the Father, and so things like that. We just kind of, briefly go over things in the Apostles' Creed. in the Nicene Creed, we kind of go a little bit further and describe it a little bit more.
Was that ever used, the Apostles' Creed? Is it ever?
Yeah, we can use it during Mass at times. It's up to the season and the priest at that moment. And so jumping past that pious to the next pious, because I know.
You got about 5 minutes left.
I can do that. Okay.
You better been hanging around Father Michael.
Real 5 minutes. Okay. So we have these modifications, and then we get to Pius XII. And in 1955, he did a rule change, which meant that the chief was the calendar, and the bringing back. See, he had been in addition, bringing back the Holy Week devotions, meaning that they were there, but he brought back the Vigil Mass, which was sometimes done, but it took on a totally different form. But he brought it back to where we would see in the earlier church form of having it as a vigil leading up to midnight, and you would have the baptisms and everybody who's coming in, with all that stuff that happened then. So he's the one who got that one back on track. So we have him to thank for that one. And he also did some changes and modifications and giving new chant notations. And then a little bit of revisions from some of the prayers that we say in Holy Week, but that's about to the extent of that. But he also said that whenever Mass is happening, when the priest is saying the readings in Latin, that the deacon, sometimes the subdeacon, can do the epistle in the vernacular, and also the deacon can do the gospel in the vernacular while the priest is, saying it in Latin quietly. So we have this, we can sort of see a little bit of movement, and the big document that we pegged all, like, we want to say liturgical reforms, because that doesn't really describe what it's doing, was let me say this because I know a lot of you know it, Mother Church in English. So he goes over the liturgy, about the liturgy, how it works, our devotion, and so when it got to the Second Vatican Council, they were saying, why in the world do we have to write a constitutional liturgy? We just use what Pope Pius did. I mean, literally, it came down to a vote. Do we use this or do we make something else? In very thin margin. And most of the stuff that's in the document, the Second Vatican Council came out with the liturgy, is the exact same thing that came out with Pius. However, they did not cite every single thing because the footnotes would have been longer than the document itself. And I'm not kidding. And they don't appear in there, but you can see the citations and other works where they kind of point to where it says what Pius said, all the Pius said, 5th, 10th, and so on and so forth. But okay, coming up to that, then St. John 23rd, after Venerable Pius. So they're all getting into Saint Land. John the 23rd made rubrical reforms. One thing to remember is Joseph has had the canon, because if you get a book previous of 1962, it will not say Joseph. And since that was the only thing that changed, you'll see a little caret mark, and written in Latin, including Joseph. So you would have that, and that was changed effective 1961. And he he abolished the Second Confidio again, because it came back and he was just like, okay, there's too much. And so that was changed. That's what changed, and that was in effect during the council. And I had one, but I didn't have time to run when I did it, of what it would kind of the transitional thing would look like. But if afterwards, I do have the 62, which is actually printed. It's new. It was like printed 2 years ago, but it's has the inclusion of Saint Joseph, because most of them didn't at that time. So then we get into the document of the Second Vatican Council, and then what's referred to as the New Mass with Paul VI, which when the council came together, they put the document out, they thought basically what, and we see this with the publishers, which unfortunately bring-ins, or I can't say his name, the name of the publisher, went out of business, because they said, okay, this is the council that's gonna say. And in 1967, and 66, 65, 66, 67, this is what the council was saying they're gonna do. So on one side you would have the vernacular translation, and you would have Latin, and certain parts would just be in Latin, and certain parts would be in the vernacular. Like Our Father, Latin, nice parts all in Latin, but everything was the same. It was just translated verbatim. And then in 1970, when they come out with this book, they're just like, oh dear. All these books. But you can see that, because at that moment, that was the mind of the council, what they had, and they brought out. And then we had thing after the council, well after, when we had the introduction of what we have today sort of. But as we see now, many of the fathers of the church, during the council were like, y'all mistook some stuff. And so this is how we see what we call the revisions and the translations, how we got our current translation, where we went from you to spirit, and our computer now has, instead of through my fault, as it once was, to my fault, my most grievous fault, because in the Latin it said, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, even in the revised version. So, and since it's only just in the grand scheme of a few years from the council, things are still in flux. Meaning that the council, we still have that one canon, the first teaching prayer, but things kind of shift around it. And that's why we see Pope Benedict, Saint John Paul II started the ball rolling to kind of like, okay guys, we need to get back to what we're going to. And then Benedict took that up and brought that forward a little bit more. And Francis now is doing the same. As he told the I forget the name of the group, one of the congregations over the liturgy, he said, follow what he started, continue that. That's why we're hearing a lot about Ad Orientem, because it was thought that we were all going to be facing that direction. And so that those little modifications and corrections, modifications like that we're doing now, or we're kind of doing the, what they did the first time around. Okay, we're going to have to kind of make sure we get all this stuff together so we don't mess it up for the future, and kind of, which would, same thing that Pius V did in that time period. So, and therefore there is the wrap of the Mass, and we're done.
Great.
2,000 years of history just like that?
Exactly. Well, let's go ahead and finish up a prayer. Father, and Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Angel of God, my guardian
Dear,
to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day be at my side, to guide, to guard, to rule, and guide. Amen.
The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.